I want to return, if I can, to the subject of the editorial, the debate about IBAC and involvement potentially of the Premier. Those revelations today that it's reported it is examining the conduct of Daniel Andrews over dealings with the United Firefighters Union. Now, importantly, we've known for 2 years that IBAC was looking at the broader issue of the Firefighters Union, but this is the first time it's been reported that their investigations involve scrutiny of the Premier. Brad Batten is the Shadow Minister for Police and Emergency Services. He's also a former police officer. He joins me now from Melbourne. Thank you for your time, Brad. I made the point then, I'm going to make it again. This is what most people at home are saying. If Gladys Berejiklian has resigned as Premier in New South Wales and as Member of Parliament because she's under investigation, not charged, not guilty, but merely under investigation by her state's anti-corruption body, surely the question is Daniel Andrews must do the same.
Yeah, good evening, Peter. And I think you're 100% right. We couldn't agree with you more. When you've got someone in north of here and we're speaking so highly of someone up in New South Wales for stepping down and doing the right thing, and yet we've got a Premier here who, taking out the comparison even against Gladys, you could put comparisons against himself. This is a man who has continued to say that any person under scrutiny, even in the 4 years that they were in opposition and continued, should be stood down or move aside. But it tends to be only when it's not him or it's not his closest friends. We've known this there's issues within the fire services for a long time. And we know we've actually referred to IBAC at one stage, and we went very public with that at the time, that we wrote a letter to IBAC because we had concerns about the dealings between the current Premier, Daniel Andrews, and the United Firefighters Union management. And we wanted to make sure that was investigated to ensure that we had an open and honest and transparent position when we're talking about some of the deals that have been done between those two parties.
What I found interesting today is if the Premier has always refused to answer questions about IBAC, today was a consistent doorstop message or a media conference message. But we know 2 years ago when he was asked about the questions in relation to this probe, he said, I haven't been spoken to, I'll get it right, I haven't been spoken to, no one in my office has been spoken to, this does not involve me. Today he refused to countenance any questions. I played that at the top of the show. Surely if he is being investigated, that form of words looks to me that he knows he's being investigated.
Yeah, I've sat in enough interviews, as you said at the start there, Peter, I was an ex-police officer, and you sit in enough interviews where a good lawyer would tell someone to make no comment. Daniel Andrews should have stuck by that advice from the original time, because if he was willing to say 2 years ago that he hadn't been interviewed and no one in his office had been interviewed, then he should be willing to say that today, because nothing restricts him from saying that. What would restrict him is if IBAC have interviewed him and he is under a condition that he can't speak public, then that may change the way he has to comment in the public arena at the moment if he is being investigated and he knows. That could impact on what he has to say to the community or in media because of the implications of what happened with IBAC. But if he said it before with no restrictions, he should be able to say it now if he can comfortably say he's not under investigation and if he can more comfortably say that he has not been spoken to. But if he has been spoken to, I'd raise serious concerns, not just in the media, but within Parliament, as Matthew Guy did today, that the Premier may be aware he's been investigated. And I think that's a real concern if he knows he's been investigated and still wants to remain as the Premier, making decisions for our state.
I went through it's not just this, right? I went through a whole list of other examples. We know with Lawyer X, it ended up in the High Court to bury the issue, hide it from the Australian public. It was released after a High Court decision. The information about the police informant, defence barrister, and the concern there with that, which could now mean a whole lot of fairly nefarious individuals are released from prison. We know with red shirts, again, all the way to the High Court, $1 million spent by taxpayers, by the government, keeping this out again of the public domain. Why is this government so determined to keep us in a secret sort of police state in Victoria? I mean, it's not transparent. Parliament hasn't sit as it should. It doesn't have the powers that the federal government does in terms of, powerful Senate committees. This is not a government where there is much obvious democracy.
Yeah, and I think you've said it right there, where this government will do anything to hide the things and hide the facts from getting out to the community, and that's a real concern, and everybody should be worried about that, because that's a major impact in our democracy. And when a government fights against the Ombudsman to protect themselves, I think, and uses taxpayers' money, if they were using their own Labor Party money, although I wouldn't agree with it, at least I'd turn around and say they're not using taxpayers' money to fight against information that taxpayers should have. But we actually have a former clerk of the Parliament who wrote a document in relation to our democracy here in Victoria, and they've written, Ray Purdy, who's written, he's concerned about what's happening in democracy. If anyone wants to see a way to tear apart what's happening in any democracy, you only need to look at what Daniel Andrews is doing, where he has now cut Parliament to 5 hours a day. We only sit from 9 until 2 o'clock. Now, that's only 3 days a week and 15 hours. This is a man that's saying, I'm working hard for you. Well, I'm sorry, Daniel Andrews, you're not working hard. You've cut the Parliament back. You've stopped the government being questioned. We've got a leader who's willing to stand up to you right now, and all you want to do is hide, run, and cover everything in your tracks to make sure you can't be questioned, even in the media. And Peter, we know, because you've been there at some stages during those media conferences, we see too often where he just stands there with the same answer over and over again, and people aren't willing to take him on. We need to be able to take him on, or democracy is at risk in Victoria for a long period of time if this man continues.
Brad Batten, I can see why you were an effective police officer before politics. Thank you for your time. Shadow Minister there for Emergency Services. Thank you.